Welcome to SEC Plus. Gary Laney of Advanced Digital with you today with a couple of recruiting writers, John Talty of AL.com, James Smith of NOLA.com joining us by phone today. And James Franklin of Penn State made a little bit of a headline last week when some SEC coaches complained about some of his creative recruiting tactics, doing something he couldn't do in the SEC by sending coaches to be guest coaches in the South at mid-major camps. Of course, the SEC is known for creative recruiting. And guys, let's talk about some of the more creative recruiters that are still in the SEC. James Franklin used to be one, and he's obviously now gone to Penn State. And let's start with a guy who's no longer in the SEC, but still has a pretty big influence in Gene Chizik. Jimmy, we were just talking about it. He did some pretty creative things that are still influential now, right?
Yeah, Auburn's always been on the cutting edge of recruiting tactics and the things they do to kind of bring attention to their program. And I remember when Chizik was there with Trooper Taylor, they rolled out this rolling tour, limousine tour, where they kind of went around to different places and really drew a lot of attention from recruits and of course had some of the media buzzing as well because it was something that was unique, and that's something that's common with Auburn. We see that they're very aggressive as they are creative. They're just as aggressive on the recruiting trail, and it's paid big dividends for them in the past. And they're definitely one of the schools that year after year seems to come out with some new idea on how to attract attention to their university.
Yeah, John, it seems like Gus Malzahn's kind of built on that, kept some elements of what Chizik did and built on it some since.
Absolutely. And when Chizik was there, he started this thing called Big Cat Weekend, which actually just happened this past weekend, in which he invites some of the top recruits, some of their top targets. Instead of focusing on just football, they try to do some fun, almost bonding things. For instance, they have pie eating contests, water balloon fights, scavenger hunts, stuff like that, which is kind of unique. You don't see a lot of schools. I don't think you're seeing Nick Saban, watching over his top recruits in a pie eating contest. But it's really kind of been able to promote this family environment, and it's helped them get a couple commits. They got 2 commits last year. This past recruiting weekend, they got a lot of guys kind of buzzing about them. So as Jimmy said, Auburn always seems to have some kind of unique ways of doing things, and Big Cat Weekend is another thing that Chizik kind of implemented at Auburn that continues to pay a lot of dividends for them.
And John, Auburn isn't the only place that's doing fun things. Talk about a coach who's bringing art into into the recruiting repertoire.
Yeah, I mean, kind of utilizing some personalized art isn't that common, isn't that unique nowadays. But one of the things that Jeff Collins at Mississippi State was really one of the first people to kind of get in front of that boat. He's a guy who, if you've seen him, did a can of swag for Marlon Humphrey, a 5-star target. He's the guy that wrote the "You're a Baller" letter that got a lot of media attention, and just kind of did a lot of personalized, some might call weird, but creative recruiting letters. And we've seen, Mark Richt kind of do some of that this past year, doing these personalized drawings for top Georgia targets. And Collins is one of the guys that I've personally noticed is one of the first people to really get kind of into that stuff. And obviously, they didn't get Humphrey last year, but they kind of created a lot of media buzz. And that helps when you're at a school like Mississippi State that, has to kind of try to beat out maybe more well-known SEC programs for recruits.
And Jimmy, you talk about trying to make things personal. Frank Wilson's really done a pretty good job of that at LSU with some of the family-type atmosphere things they try to do.
Yeah, I mean, recruiting has become more personal, as a whole. I mean, with social media and everything, you see more parents getting involved now. The media is creating a lot of buzz, and so you see a lot more people starting to surround the kids, and as a result, these schools are trying to create these family environments and these days and events that kind of bring that to light. And we saw that this weekend at the Bayou Picnic, which is the second of LSU's Bayou circuit. They had the Boys from the Boot that they do earlier in the recruiting cycle. And the whole objective there is just to bring in as many in-state prospects as possible, a handful of out-of-state prospects, and really just have a lot of one-on-one time with the family, show them the facilities. But as much as that, to really have them bond with the coaches and develop that relationship that's become so vital now, because kids are often making decisions based on their relationships with their coaches. So Frank Wilson has definitely been on the leading edge of that. And one school we can't pass up here is Alabama, possibly the most aggressive recruiting team in the country. Nick Saban definitely takes advantage of every restriction that's lifted from the NCAA as far as contact and things like that. And he's been busy on Skype lately. You talk to a lot of prospects, and they've had a lot of 30-minute conversations with Nick Saban via Skype, which is fairly unique and something that I think a lot of coaches are going to start implementing themselves. And it's been very successful for them. Tony Brown, a big 5-star corner for the 2014 class, ended up at Alabama, and the tide turned in their favor with Brown after a good Skype conversation with Saban and Tony from the hospital room with his father. So, I mean, Nick Saban is always pushing the envelope himself, and they're as aggressive as they are creative. And there's just SEC is definitely the leading conference when it comes to trying to implementing new ideas, and it's the most aggressive region in the country as far as recruiting is concerned. So, I mean, it's quite an adventure just to keep up with what these schools do on their campuses week after week.
One last quick question. SEC, obviously, the region has the best players. That bears out every year. SEC have the best recruiters? Is that pretty safe to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. When you're talking Frank Wilson and what he's done, and half the coaching hires in the SEC are solely based on a coach's ability to recruit and their areas, and that's what drives the SEC conference is the talent that these teams bring in. So, I mean, I think it's easy to say any given year that you could put your dollar on it that the SEC is probably filled with the best group of recruiters on college staff.
Last word to you, John.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with that. I mean, hard to argue with the track records. Every year you're looking at the recruiting rankings, and the SEC schools are at the top, pretty much every year. I mean, clearly there are top recruiters. I think James Franklin is a terrific recruiter, and he's going to kill it at Penn State. Urban Meyer and his staff at Ohio State, they're going to do very well consistently. But I think if you look at it as a whole conference, SEC is just more aggressive and ultimately more successful than the other, kind of conference peers.
I'll close out by saying this, John. 2 coaches, you mentioned the Big Ten, former SEC head coaches. So there you go. SEC, great recruiting league, and it's a great league because of it. For John and James, I'm Gary. We'll see you next week.